So this week we're all designed. We are joined by designers Kritika Manchanda and Yayi Chen. So I'm going to give you a little bio for each of our guests. They'll share some of their work via slideshows, and then we'll jump into our 4 standard questions. And hopefully time will allow for a little bit longer discussion because they can also share some of their videos, and we'll have a little bit of time to talk about potentially where we're going after this in fashion, or some potential for what happens next in the world. So Yayi Chen is a fashion designer and artist graduated from Parsons School of Design with academic experience also at Central St. Martin's in London through exchange learning. Yayi grew up in both Spain and China, and her work focuses on women's identity and society throughout history within multicultural backgrounds. During her stay in New York, she obtained multiple fashion design awards, including the CFDA Scholarship Award, and professional experience working for renowned fashion houses like the Row and Thom Browne. Kritika Manchanda is a designer and visual artist based in New York. She won the CFDA Geoffrey Beene Scholarship Award in 2018 and was a finalist for the Gucci Design Fellowship Program in 2019. Her process as an artist involves curating historical objects and recontextualizing them. With a focus on Indian craft practices and the intricate processes behind them, her work transforms itself into an archive intersecting identity, culture, and tradition. So first, I'd like to say on behalf of FSA, thank you both so much for joining. And for anyone who I don't know, my name's Sarah Bird, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Fashion Studies Alliance. And I'm actually very excited to have the opportunity to talk to people who are doing design work in this space, because it's one of our goals in this community is to really connect all of the people working in various branches. So with that being said, I'd like for you guys to now enjoy some visuals associated with each of our designers' work.
Thank you, Sarah, for having us. I'm just going to share my screen. We're all familiar with this now, so. All right. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my thesis, and this is, of course, a 2-year-long research, which I'm going to try and distill into a 5-minute presentation. So I'll try my best to share as much as I can. So the thesis was called, or ended up being called, Body of Clothing, and you will hopefully know why soon. I started out exploring 2 main themes during my research. One of them was this idea of identity, coming from India, growing up in India, and then moving to New York, and the sort of sense of displacement that comes from that. I wanted to tap into that. And of course, we all are familiar with this term called cultural appropriation, and it's such a buzzword these days. And it's often thought that it's sort of a newer concept as an onset of, PC culture, and people are just angry about and quick to get offended, when in fact this has been happening for hundreds of years. And if you look at art movements like chinoiserie, there was always this sort of idea of taking from the mystical East and taking elements from other cultures, while at the same time systemically destroying sort of craft practices and traditional industries that supported those very inspiration themes. And so this was something that I wanted to look into, and sort of taking it into a more personal space, looking into the impact of the colonial imposition on India. And so I started out with some initial sort of play experimentations. So on the left, there was just this idea of object making and using the banality of tea bags to sort of convey something deeper like race and identity. And then on the right, this idea of an alternate self. What would I be dressing like or speaking like had colonization not happened historically? And then another theme that I was exploring simultaneously was this idea of space, and how in order for a wearer to occupy clothing, there needs to be space within the clothes, which is the basic functionality of it, and what would happen if we played around with that, and also the performative aspect of putting on garments. Um, and so these were some initial early researches that I did using a 3D pen, sort of sculpting bodies and removing the bodies from within them and the disintegration that occurs through that process. Um, and then also taking motifs, Indian motifs, playing around with it on Photoshop, rasterizing them, and then again, creating these 3D sculptures, if you will, using a 3D.
Kritika,
Uh-huh.
we can only see a black screen right now. Aha, now we got it.
Great. All right, so I'm just gonna continue where I left off. But sort of exploring materialities like 3D pen, just to sort of create a different sort of material to the table. And then obviously a part of me felt like this wasn't the most authentic way to explore these crafts, because I was talking about these century-old crafts which had a specific hand feel to them, and there was a specific material that was used. Historically, it was muslin. And so the 3D explorations weren't really doing it for me in a sense. And so that led me to explore muslin, and that of course is a larger conversation and the impact of muslin in India. So I'm not going to get into that, but eventually that led me to the craft of chicken curry, and I was able to acquire two pieces, historical objects from the late 19th century, and these were both chicken curry pieces. And the photograph, of course, doesn't do it justice, but the level of intricacy and craftsmanship was just phenomenal. And so that was this turning point for me in my research, where I sort of decided that if I was going to be talking about these crafts, it had to be in its most truest and authentic form. And that led me to travel to India, which I think was the best decision that I made. And chicken curry, is the practice has a GI tag, which means it can only be considered chicken curry if it's done in Lucknow. So I traveled to Lucknow, and I was able to sort of immerse myself in the practice, being able to work with the artisans. And this isn't just like one artisan embroidering on one fabric, there's an entire ecosystem around it. So you have your person that's making and carving the wooden blocks, which then goes and gets imprinted onto the fabric, and there's a person that does that. And then there's an artisan who's embroidering it, and then there's a washing cycle that happens. So there are all of these communities that come together to make one motif get embroidered eventually. And so that was so fascinating. So I started developing these embroideries. Some of these blocks were hundreds of years old, and they weren't being used as much anymore just because of the level of intricacy and the sort of cost involved. And so it was really important to me to not change it in any way and use these blocks as they were. And so I was able to develop a bunch of embroideries there. And then going back to that idea of the space and the wearer, I was doing experiments with the removal of space from within clothing. And so using yardage to create 3D garments and then compressing them. And there was process of heat and compression and starch that were applied to sort of almost create this fossil of a garment. And then eventually I ended up combining the two worlds, where these embroideries became housed within the compression, and sort of this became the means of preservation for me. And this was some of the earlier explorations, and some of the final pieces and the final work ended up looking like. Some detail shots. And so again, going back to that performative aspect of going from the 2D to the 3D and then back again, and the cyclical nature of that. And it was also important for me to present it in a way where on the left you see a more traditional sort of photo shoot, if you will, a fashion shoot, if you will, where the garment is being worn by the wearer, but also to record them as these objects as if you were to find them in a gallery or a museum. And so this was the final collection, and that is it.
Great, thank you so much.
So hi everyone, I'm Yayi Chen, and thank you for everyone who's here online to share this conversation with us today. Today I'm presenting my thesis collection also, called In Transient. I'm going to share my screen now. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Just to check. Okay, perfect. So yeah, my collection is called Intransient. So I'm going to start to talk a little bit about how I began this collection. So coming from a similar cross-cultural background as my collaborator, Kathy Moe, she's an artist based in London. And we together came across with this concept called Intransient. It is inspired by our mother's experience as participants of the first wave of immigration from the South Chinese to Europe during the 80s and 90s. So yeah, this is the time background where the entire story began. So Intransient became a collaborative collection of fashion, performance, and film, which aims to question the overlooked and objectified laboring body of women in the immigrant community that I grew up in. Yeah, so this collection also explores the poetic relationship between this woman's invisible social identity and their impermanent home and working space, which is the Chinese restaurant that I grew up in, as many other Chinese immigrants did in that era. As you can see from the images in my design system, the women are fully covered by lace bodysuits and translucent knits, which reflects their invisible identity. My garments and accessories are also in collaboration with a New York-based accessory designer, who is also a friend of mine. And all the accessories and garments that you see are heavily adorned with drop beads, flaring fringes, and decorative knit jacquards that are enhances the objectification of woman's body that I'm trying to talk about in my collection. Yeah. Also, each of the looks in my collection is the symbolic objects from the Chinese restaurant interior, which I have transformed from a wearable garment into an object through the performance that I'm going to show at the end of the presentation. Yeah, in order to explore the poetic relationship between immigrant women's invisible social identity and their impermanent working space. Yeah. And later I'm going to show more poses of my collection. Sarah?
Great.
Thank you. Yeah.
You're welcome. Thank you both for that. Now's the fun part where we ask some questions. So once you exit out the screen, we'll just pretend like we're looking at each other and talking in real life. But I think one of our first questions also is kind of answered a little bit by the work that you just shared for both of you, which is how did you get here, right? Because you both discussed this kind of like the feelings of leaving one place and coming to another and those transitions. But I'll give you both a little bit of space to expand upon that question of how'd you get here? However that means for you, whether it's like literally where you are today or at this point in your work.
So for me, I think a lot of people don't know this, but I actually have a background in finance. Back in India, I was working as a financial researcher for Standard & Poor, which is a credit rating agency. And it wasn't that I was unhappy doing what I was doing. It was fine. I was good at it. But I think there was always this creative side of me that wasn't being fulfilled. And so there was always this inclination towards the arts and towards fashion. And so I decided to sort of take the plunge, and I decided to do another undergrad, and I decided to move to FIT to pursue fashion design as a career and as a full-time job. And so that is when I moved to New York. And I think the past 5 years or 5 or 6 years, I think I'm just so glad that I made that decision. And hopefully, I think the kind of work that I'm doing now, it makes me really happy, and it's very fulfilling. And so here I am now.
Great. Yayi?
Yes, so I'll continue sharing. Okay, so similarly as Kritika's concept, my concept also began asking about the question of the relationship between the space, movement, and fashion. So I began to ask myself the question, do fashion and the space we inhabit intimately bound up with our sense of identity or reflect the same identity? Yeah, so basically, the research process of my collection was a very long one. Um, it was, as I said, a collaborative process. So I first began researching about my personal identity, where the collection began, through the woman that I'm talking about, which is the Chinese immigrant community in the Spanish society that I grew up in. And this research was an autoethnographic one where I looked through all my uh, home family albums from the 80s and 90s. I took out all the photos where women were depicted in the images, and I took out the image of woman to explore how the invisible identity of woman could be. Yeah. So I also did a very in-deep social research. And from this research, I realized that in the field of family enterprise research, the role played by Chinese women in Spain has always been approached as secondary and also been hidden. So from this spot, I began to like take out the woman images from the family photos, and I realized that in very big events, the number of women shown were always very minimized. Yes, so I began to look at how women and their labor space work together. So I thought I could dig in more into this relationship of how poetically women are uh, like working out with the space around them. So I look further into the idea of topo analysis, which is a form of research which examines the intimacy of the house, room after room, space after space. I took this research method as a way of transforming objects into a woman's body as a representation of their overlooked working body and their objectified identity. And how I did it is that I transform each of the look in my collection is transformed from an object. For example, the curtain look. I use all the details, including fabrics that are made from curtain, into this woman's wear look that is presented here. And I use bodysuits to cover all the women to represent that silhouette that I took out from the images that I initially showed you. Yeah. And I also did some accessories work with my collaborators. And I use a lot of beading, as you can see, all hand beading. And of course, the lace that I've used is a representation of the Spanish identity that I have, combined with some qipao details that I take from the Chinese uniform that we see in Chinese restaurants when I grew up. And I also developed a lot of knit jacquards that are, the floral prints are derived from the Chinese screen in the Chinese restaurants that I grew up in. And yeah, the way I see fashion, it's not just a piece of garment on a body, but also how the garment can become itself an art piece in a space, and how it becomes an embodiment of the space and the space language and the woman's body. And I try to express that through photography and visual arts. Yes, that's some of the process I want to share.
Great.
Thank you.
It's interesting, you know, I think listening to you both talk about your process and how many times the word research comes up, and it's definitely, I'm not going to lie, one of the main reasons why you two are the people that we're talking to today is because of that kind of strong foundation in research, right? And we're not just talking about like, oh, I looked at some things on Google, right? It's
Right.
like
Yeah.
really strongly rooted in like true academic methodologies and deep investigative research into a subject, which, you know, is definitely a space that I think we want to expand in fashion because we have so many challenging things that come up. So I'm going to slightly modify our second question because you both briefly kind of talked about this and acknowledged it. But I want to kind of get more specific about what your training and education was that allowed you or supported you to kind of go through these research processes.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll go first. Okay, so like I mentioned a little bit before as well, so I had this background in finance, but then of course, I decided to switch to fashion. And I think my initial 2 years was mostly very technical. So the associates program at FIT has a very strong foundation in technical skills. But then coming into the MFA, I think the way I thought about fashion started changing, where you sort of like think of it beyond clothing, and really looking at sort of thinking about it from an anthropological perspective, researching an object in its entirety. How did it come to be? Of course, I had incredible professors. Sarah Bird was one of them. And of course, there was a lot of resources at hand with the FIT Museum and Library. There was the Met Prati Center. But I think there was that sort of distance, the physical distance from the things that I was researching and the things that I was talking about, because there's only so much that you can get out of a book. And so for me, it became exceedingly important to, like I mentioned, like traveling to India was such a turning point because it's that sort of on-ground research. You learn things and you find out things that you cannot possibly learn from a book. And I always also sort of stressed on interdisciplinary research, so not just focusing on crafts from one particular skills from one particular industry like fashion. So also looking at, say, fine art or image making or even like making art objects. So kind of like allowing the work to overlap and breathe in a way. And so eventually all of that academic research and in-ground research and then making and exploration, all of that comes together in a way that where you end up creating something which you cannot if you were to start out with a plan in mind. And so that allows it to flow in a way where you are almost discovering as you go what you're making.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. I had a background at fine arts in high school, where I took IB studies, and I really think I began looking at fashion without technicals as well. I started to paint and did a lot of sculptures, but I always had that passion towards textiles. So in my high school times, I look at fashion, but in a more textiles perspective and more object perspective as well. I loved surrealism, yeah, since I grew up. So, and I think this has still continued in my studies from Parsons, where I got an idea of how to market a collection, merchandise a good collection from a very like industry level perspective, I think, together with a creative part of it. And I also obtained a lot of technical problem solving like questions, answers from my studies in Parsons as well. But I think also a turning point that I had in my studies was my exchange at Central St. Martin's in London. And to be honest, it was also the experience where I met most of my collaborators for this thesis collection, because I actually filmed and did this collaboration project remotely from London to New York. Yes, it was a pretty hard experience, but I really, really enjoyed it. And I learned how to work with other artists as well, because for me, what I wanted to explore more is the cross-disciplinary exploration of fine art and fashion, or other fields in contemporary art, such as theater, music. All these genders could be part working together with fashion to me. Yeah, so I think the combination of both the marketing part and the artistic part has really bring me a balance between how to manage art and fashion together. Yeah.
Great. It's really interesting that you both kind of have these like different ways of understanding the sort of not so much the creative process, because that's something that I think is individual to everyone, but that you both have incorporated in like some sort of business or like financial connection to this. Do you think that's an important component to kind of moving forward with your work, or is it just something good to have as like a foundation?
No, I think it's incredibly important, and just being able to sort of within a school setting, but being able to like remove myself from that and having connections with actual industries and commissioning pieces, and then being able to sort of distill that into something else and present it to a person that might want to end up acquiring that piece. I think the finance of it plays in heavily. Also, rethinking ideas of who owns the craft, because oftentimes, you know, there is the designer, but then a lot of the artisans aren't really considered as part of the design process. And with me specifically, where I wasn't really designing the motifs, I was taking from historical objects. So trying to sort of do it in a way that was, or as best as I could, in a way that was fair and that was um, not appropriating in itself, was really important to me. So just being able to interact with the industry in a way that's not exploiting the industry is really important. I think now more than ever, we need to be having conversations about that, just because um, we're obviously realizing that consumption for the sake of it is just not leading us anywhere. And so rethinking the way that we're, as an industry, interacting, and how things can't just be siloed and everything needs to move in a more sort of cohesive manner.
Yeah, I think you both brought up this idea of collaborators and community. Yeah, do you want to add to that too?
Definitely, because from my experience working with other artists and designers, I really feel fashion is not just a one man's work. It's definitely a teamwork, especially with collaborations such as films and theatrical work. It's just a big team that you have to control, and also the deadlines, and also how to work remotely into different spaces, how to keep the project going, because artists are all very individual workers, but in the end, to make a big project, you really need so much people effort in it. Yeah, so also I've learned this through my personal work experience as well. I think it's so important that you know how to communicate with different people, and you know how to deal with different ideas and come up with something like balance at the end. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So our next question for you both is there any part of your career or experience that has been particularly motivating or had a massive impact on where you decided to go with this whole fashion thing?
So I keep coming back to this, but I think it goes back again to the moment where I decided to take that trip to India, because oftentimes in design education, there is sometimes a focus on too much innovation for the sake of it, or, you know, sort of deconstructing things or taking an inspiration and then turning it around on its head. And when I sort of acquired those pieces, I can actually show them now that I'm not sharing my screen, but like these are like some of the pieces that I acquired, and just being able to like touch them and feel them, that was the turning point where I decided that I had to make it in its most authentic self, and sort of laser cutting it or 3D printing it so was not going to do it for me. And so being able to give myself that permission to not innovate for once and to just allow the craft to live on, because if I was talking about preservation, it needed to be authentic. And so just for me, that was such a big turning point in trying to not do too much and just letting the craft be. And of course, making those actual connections, traveling to India and being able to work with a number of artisans. It was actually the moment where I sort of figured out that this is what I want to do and this is the kind of work that I want to make. And there's a reason that it's making me so happy. And so it was just, yeah, it was like the biggest turning point for me.
And that was fairly recently, right? Within the last year?
It was in fact fairly late into my thesis as well, and which was alarming because a lot of my peers were ahead of me in many ways, and I was still discovering this process, which I commissioned these pieces in the final semester, and there's of course a time gap and a geographical sort of uh, point of issue was there. So there was a lot of factors, and I came into this very late, which is actually why I'm sort of continuing with this, because there's just so much that needs to be explored. And so I'm still like going on with this research, and there's just so much that can be explored here.
Yeah,
Yeah. For me, I'd like to share more about my cultural experience. I think my personal multicultural upbringing has really impacted my work for most. Being born to a Chinese immigrant family in Spain, I had a chance to really being exposed to very different values and art forms with big contrasting ideas from a very young age. So with this cultural contrast, I often reflected on my personal identity as a woman and the complex identity of the community that I live in. So I think most of my inspirations in work and the idea of how to empower women through fashion comes from my personal experience growing up as under this multicultural background and my personal observations as well. Yeah.
I really, I appreciate how much both of you talk about kind of, in very different ways, you want to preserve certain elements of the past, but it's not in this way that someone like myself, who, you know, is more used to working with historical objects in museum collections, where it is this like very static almost moment in time that it will never go beyond that use, right? But you both are transforming like how that moves into a future space in these very different ways. So can you, this is maybe like a perfect kind of starting to transition question where we can share a few more videos of your work too, but to talk about where you're going next with this, like, and then I want to ask you a question about presentation after our videos.
So like I mentioned, like this is something there's so much to explore here with the chicken curry, and I've only barely scratched the surface. And so that is something that's an ongoing research, and that's just happening that's always, I'm going to be adding to that always. But other than that, there are other crafts I'm exploring. I joke that there isn't a 19th century craft that I haven't liked. So I'm looking at like trapunto and quilting a lot these days, and also smocking. So I was able to acquire this smocking pleater from eBay, which is like this historical object in itself. So I'm doing a lot of textile manipulations on that. I was actually fortunate enough to be in India right before things got really crazy with the lockdown. So I was able to travel to Jaipur, where they do a lot of quilting for for home goods, not for clothing. But I wanted to sort of start that dialogue with artisans there, which I did a little bit. And now, of course, everything is at a standstill. But also, at the very moment, I'm also allowing myself to be okay with not doing anything. I think all of us, this is a good time for a pause for all of us. So I think there are limitations of geography and of space in my home right now. So I'm allowing myself to not get riled up about it and just make as much as I can if I want to, when I want to, but also not. So that's what I'm doing or not doing right now.
Good. I mean, I think New York State is called on pause. Not
Yeah.
that any of us are actually that paused, but yeah, do you want to tell us where you're going next, and then we'll share both of your videos.
Yes, I think for me, yeah, space is also the problem because all my collaborators are in different places, and my family is also in China. So yeah, and here stopped. So I'm also in a very awkward position, but luckily I also teach online. So I'm a TA, and I could still work on this area. And I think it's such a coincidence because I just went into this online platform teaching, and I didn't realize that I could still work as a TA when during this quarantine. Yeah, so it's very lucky. And I also started to work in the industry as well, in different companies, because I feel before really going into as an independent designer, I really need to obtain all the basic understanding of how fashion business is, not just fashion as art, right? Yeah, so I'm working on that as well. But in the meantime, I'm also continuing my collaboration with my artist collaborator in Europe. She's in London, and I think in the meantime, I would like to show also some process that we had as we work together, just to have an idea. Let me share the screen. Okay, so here. Can you see?
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, I would like to show some process of how we did the research from combining fashion into a piece of performance, and this is also something we are continuing working on to get deeper about our understanding of our identity as a Chinese immigrant. Yeah, this was some research that we did, and then we also thought about how the movements and ethic symbols in a performance could reflect our identity and could combine the space, objects, and fashion together. And that was also another part from my collaborator because she's a choreographer and fine artist. Yeah, so the entire performance outcome ended up as a community collaboration, as I already mentioned, and all members from this collaboration were actually all members of the Asian immigrant community in Europe. And this was my main aim because I feel today the art field and the fashion field, we work as a community. The idea of community is so important. It has so much message behind. And also, we really talk about identity today in the fashion world. So I think working as communities is something I want to continue doing. Gathering people from the same immigrant background, it's something I'm hoping to continue working on. And yeah, this was an image of the space that came up as a outcome from my work. I was placing all the garments in the space that I took the inspiration from. And this was some images from the performance that you later see in the video. Yeah. That's about it. And if you want to see the full video, you can go to my website. Okay. Yeah.
Great. Um, thanks. Kritika, do you want to share your video?
Sure, because we were talking about how to share work in this time, and obviously everyone's talking about how runway shows aren't necessarily as valid as they used to be, and just different ways of distilling information and sort of presenting work. And so I'm just going to show two short videos. One of them is more process based, and the other one is about just different ways of presenting work. Um,
One of the reps.
so that was just a little bit about the process behind the work, and then this is just a video about different ways of presenting the work as not just a runway show, like I mentioned, but maybe it could be an art installation, a performance, art piece. So just thinking about different ways of presenting work.
Thank you. So with that in mind, like I think, you know, this is the question I have for you both, and just kind of generally too. You know, this whole idea of a fashion runway presentation, right? So to have an object that is so kind of like deeply researched and designed with all of these very subtle details and meanings and expressions in there. You know, and a garment walks the runway for what, 30 seconds at most, right? It's a very like flash of an instant, and what kind of lives on is whatever photograph is captured in that moment. And so whether you're a viewer at the physical space of it or the person on the computer looking at that thing, so much of that is gone, right? It doesn't exist in that presentation. It's lost in this. So, you know, I think between the question of like the performance aspect, where you bring even kind of longer pause to that study and reflection of the presentation, or in the opposite case, the actual removal of the body from the garments, potentially has some interesting kind of space to expand into. Do you think that would be something that you want to continue for yourself? And do you think that's something that we could maybe see happening in any other kind of like larger industry space?
Absolutely. I think more and more, I think people's attention spans are shifting. And so doing the same thing over and over again is not working. I think Runway shows the amount of waste that is created and the amount of travel that's involved. A lot of it is unnecessary. And like you mentioned, it's just a fleeting moment where someone like my work or Yayi's as well, where there's a lot of detail and a lot of intricacy involved. I think it's a disservice to present it in a way that I would rather have the spectator sort of be able to interact with the work more, and something that's more immersive and more involved. I think there is definitely room for different ways of presenting work. Hopefully, when we get out of this, we can we can talk about maybe it could be like a gallery setting. It could be even storefronts are changing. I think just being able to sort of physically interact with garments, I think there's a longing for that, because we're probably going to have had enough of the online through this COVID. So hopefully in the future.
Well, for me, I always loved fashion versus history and fashion versus culture. So I often see fashion as a piece of artwork or as a exhibit object in the gallery, like for myself. So to me, it's so normal that fashion could be outside of the runway. Actually, more, I really like to encourage more fashion into presentations or into exhibits rather than just very expensive runways, but it's all about the celebrity, about the flashing moment, but then all the work behind is kind of being forgotten. Since I've worked really in the fashion runways a lot, I really think there's so much work behind the fashion runways that we are not seeing as an audience. Yeah, so I really encourage fashion being turned into other forms of presentation, especially when today the lines between fashion and art are less clear, where we can merge fashion with other fields such as music, theater, performance, choreography, and that's something I'm wishing to push as well. Yes, maybe Alex share the video that I have forgotten to share in the last answer to finish up my answer. Is that?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Okay, I'll share it right now. Thank you.
Great. So I think my kind of parting thought with all this is something I was just talking about in a class earlier, in this idea that Kritika also mentioned too, if you go back to looking at fashion and its kind of like prehistory, like early development of society and community, like in the most basic form of applying any kind of ornament to the body, what you're doing in that process is creating a shared language. And you have to have a community that understands how to think symbolically and kind of communicate in nonverbal forms in order to have fashion. And what it seems like to me that your work is doing is really trying to kind of push this back into a deeper space of a nonverbal communication and an exchange of symbolic language. So I'm excited to see where you all continue with this in various ways. And thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to everybody who tuned in for us today too. Any parting words, comments?
Just thank you for doing this. This was incredible. And just, you've always been such a support and sort of been that person who's encouraged me to go into this historical space. So thank you again for sort of allowing this to happen and encouraging this. And
thank you, Sarah.
As well, they're just doing incredible work.
We're honored to have people like you both in our extended community, and we want to support it any way we can. So we have another one of these on Monday. So check our website, Instagram, etc. for more information. And thank you all again. I hope you have a good rest of your day.
So thank you. Stay safe, everyone. Bye.